Hey, I'm Angelo Pinto, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. As the Trump administration has come back into office, there's been a series of actions that have taken the country by storm. Not surprisingly, Trump immediately signed a litany of executive orders, most notably rolling back diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and threatening to end birthright citizenship. Numerous federal sites have been taken offline, not to mention the call for federal workers to resign in anticipation of being fired, partnering 1,500 January 6 insurrectionists and colluding with billionaires and enriching himself by launching a cryptocurrency in the midst of it all. Internationally, the Trump administration has commenced mass deportations, issued warnings of impending tariffs, and sharing plans to reclaim the Panama Canal and rename the Gulf of Mexico, while most recently stating the United States will take ownership of the Gaza Strip. Here to discuss these developments and more are former Speaker of the New York City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito, and the Executive Director of New York City's Commission on Racial Equity, Linda Tajani. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip. So Melissa, Donald Trump has done quite a bit, but it seems like he is certainly focusing on this issue of birthright citizenship. Many people feel like he's not going to be able to do much with it, but is there an attempt to take this issue to the Supreme Court? What do you think Donald Trump is attempting to do around the issue of birthright citizenship? And is there a racial component or dynamic to what he's talking about?
I mean, without a doubt, there is a racial component. I mean, we have heard stories, right, of Puerto Ricans, right, who are U.S. citizens that have also been rounded up. So the issue of citizenship really doesn't protect you from what the overall vision is of this administration, right, which is really about racism, about dehumanizing people of color, of saying that we're degenerates or that making it clear that we don't belong, right, and targeting us and looking and finding ways to continue to scapegoat it. Now, I really believe, and it's not just my thinking, a lot of people, right, that there is a coup in process right now. This is a hostile takeover of the U.S. government. And it's not just me being hysterical, as some may claim, but it is people like Joyce Vance, who we have heard of, and others that have been talking about what a Trump, right, presidency could look like. It's very hard for me to even say a presidency because this is definitely a coup. But what we see here is that the government is being dismantled. The level of protections that have been normally things that we take for granted are being whittled away, that it is clear that people are being targeted for who they are and what they look like, and making it clear that a certain group of people don't belong here. So we have to figure out ways that we protect ourselves. But birthright citizenship is just one tool.
And how we respond to this.
Yes.
Now, just a quick follow-up. What's the role of local government in doing this? Folks often say all politics are local. This apparently or could be viewed as a coup for sure. How do local elected officials, particularly in New York City, respond to this in an effective way that protects New Yorkers?
Well, I mean, I think we've been hearing the statement, don't obey in advance, which is very true, right? Well, unfortunately, we couldn't see two more divergent ways of leading than the mayor of Newark, right, and the mayor of New York, where you have a mayor of Newark who is talking about protecting people and saying that we are a sanctuary city and the rounding up and the raids are unacceptable. And now we're seeing a memorandum of understanding, or a memo that has emerged under this mayor in New York City, Mayor Adams, telling agencies that, hey, wink and a nod, it's okay, right, to let ICE in. It's okay if they don't have a judicial warrant, which is absolutely against what the laws are. So very divergent. We cannot obey in advance. We have to have measures of resistance. Sanctuary cities, sanctuary policies should be protected.
Linda, so one of CORE's focuses is really, or the focus of CORE is really to address racial equity. How do you see some of the ICE raids and what Trump is alluding to around birthright citizenship impacting racial equity on the ground, particularly in New York City?
I do think it's important to note that the narrative that's being used both on the federal level as well as on the local level across the nation, and certainly we're not immune to this, is to pit Black people against immigrants. Mm-hmm. When in fact that process of division is intentional. It is both a distraction, but it is to ensure that people will fight with one another rather than build the networks and coalitions that we need to be able to resist.
How do you think we respond to that in this moment? Because a lot of folks, I think when you were looking at the election, were looking to build solidarity, but there were moments where communities decided to take different directions, and many who supported Donald Trump. And I think particularly when you look at the Black community, they are still in their feelings a bit about that and not willing to come to the immediate defense of communities who've put themselves in a bad situation. How do we respond to that, and how do we build solidarity even though that future is not that distance where some folks have felt harmed as a result of what certain communities decided to do?
Certainly people have the right, and I'm excited and encouraged by people being civically engaged and really trying to grapple with the constitutional complexity that's come up as a result of all of the executive orders, as well as the proposals of potential lawsuits, both on a community level, a local level, but also to have various levels of government publicly fighting with each other over whether or not to obey or obey, or some people are choosing to obey in advance, right? And also some people are choosing to obey language and a narrative that hasn't yet been formally fully said, which is also a problem.
Certainly.
So I do think it's important to note that it was not communities of color that voted him in, but also to note that our economic instability is what has made us vulnerable to the divisive narrative that's coming on all levels.
And
right?
Melissa, do you feel like there's a need for communities, particularly in the Latino community, to have more solidarity around this issue? And how do we build that?
I mean, look, all of us in terms of that have been active in our communities, that have positions of leadership right now, need to lead. I mean, this is, an onslaught. And part of the strategy is that, for there to be an onslaught, that there's too much for us to focus on, right? And then you focus on the low-hanging fruit, and then you're not seeing what's happening behind the scenes and the other ways that they're stripping down the government and stripping us of
And
power.
that's-
So
yeah.
coming together, yes, like you're saying, coming together across communities is got to be one way to resist and to build that resistance and pushback against what we're seeing unfold.
And as you mentioned, folks have to come together, ideally in this moment, use their power, use their voice. How does local government do that in an effective way? Of course, you were the Speaker of the City Council. Do you feel like the City Council should be using its power in a different way in this moment? How do they become more effective to respond to a Trump administration? What can they do, given your past expertise?
Well, it's important to understand we've only been in this
Certainly.
2.5 weeks, right? But I think the issue, and you've seen some municipalities and states doing it, like Governor Newsom, I think, has been talking to folks in different cities in California and bringing them together. I would like to see some leadership from our governor, right, to convene different municipalities across the state and engage in this conversation. That here in the city of New York, we figure out ways that we can build that solidarity amongst communities. People are concerned at the local level in my neighborhood, East Harlem.
Definitely.
Right, to figure out ways that we can be concerned about the raids that are happening. But how do we then build that solidarity across
And we've seen, as
across
you
the city?
mentioned, some mayors and even governors respond to what's happening, particularly around ICE raids. Do you think we will see the same thing from Mayor Adams in this moment? Do you think he'll respond in a way that lends solidarity to Donald Trump or towards communities
He's
that
an
need it?
ally. I see him as an ally to Donald Trump. So I don't think I would expect that to be coming from the mayor, right? I would be expecting that to be coming from the city council, maybe from the governor, although the governor has also made some pronouncements around immigration that concern me. But there has to be some leadership that steps up and really brings us together to engage in this conversation about what are we going to do to push back.
Yeah.
Because it's not just this immediately on immigration or the birthright citizenship.
Certainly.
It's about the money that is going to be lost to community-based organizations that are important, right, that we would rely on to
Yep.
do some of this work.
Yes.
So there's a lot that is at stake, and we got to be really focused in this moment. Because
Yep.
the idea here is to dissipate our energy, overwhelm us, so that they can continue on this path of building white supremacy in this country.
And Linda, to some of those points, Eric Adams may not likely respond in the way that some of the other mayors have across the country to ICE raids. What do local organizations and even city agencies do when elected officials don't show up? What are our responsibilities in these moments?
Sure. So I do think on a local level, but also state and federal, the mechanisms that are built into democracy also include independent commissions, independent bodies, mechanisms for accountability that sort of call our elected officials to task, our agencies to task. And New York City is fairly unique in that our New York City Charter, our Constitution, outlines equity values that specifically call for the protection of our immigrant communities, but also other communities that have suffered longstanding oppression, right? And so when we're thinking about, well, we have a federal administration that is instituting even further the idea and practice of white supremacy, the idea and practice of anti-Blackness, but also the idea and practice of capitalism that we know is solely dependent on racism continuing. When we are faced with that level of an onslaught, then I think what we need to think about is, well, what are the structures that we have in place that allow us to recognize our rights not as privileges, but actually as human rights as they were intended to be in a democracy? So our charter calls us, elected officials, as well as all of our organizations and every city agency. The charter outlines the powers, the duties, the authorities, the obligations for what the city should do. So regardless of the particular political agenda of the elected official, we have a grounding document that says, actually, our responsibility is to protect our immigrant communities. Our responsibility is to protect our Black communities, that we understand that this city and nation was built on the genocide of indigenous people and long-standing violence against the Black community. And so when we're talking about solidarity and what are the possibilities, I think, to your point, certainly leadership needs to step up. And we are seeing that on a hyper-local level.
Great point, but we'll have to end it there. When we come back, we will take a different look at some of these concerns with our guests. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip. Republicans in red states have been attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion in workspaces and in higher education for years. But when Donald Trump retook the White House and trusted the federal executive branch against DEI, even blue state academics had new causes to worry. While we must respond critically to what is happening, many have expressed concerns that DEI did not address the actual needs of our communities in the first place. So the moment presents some real challenges and some real opportunities for growth, transformation, and solidarity. Still with us to discuss these things are former Speaker of New York City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito, and Executive Director of New York City's Commission on Racial Equity, Linda Tijani. And joining us virtually is anti-racism historian Ernest Prim. So Ernest, when you see what's happening with Trump's administration rolling back DEI, the attack on the Department of Education, historically, is this something we've seen before? How alarmed should we be, and how should we also respond in this moment?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I would say that we should be alarmed in the sense that it's undoing so much of our progress. But I do want to give people the perspective of understanding that most of our existence here in this country, we have not actually had these systems in place that benefit us the way we have. When you think about something like Title I, for instance, or even backs or the DEI type approaches, it's only as recent as the 1960s. And I would caution people to say that these things weren't working for us anyway, when we consider the broader context of these things don't just happen in a vacuum. We're not talking about progress that can happen in 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years. You know, I give a lot of, most times when I'm speaking, I give folks the perspective of understanding that even what Dr. King fought for, it wasn't just for him during his life, it was the past of a time. So we have to understand that historically, these things will allow us to make change incrementally over time, and we work towards perfecting them.
So Ernest, the rolling back of these things in this moment, how do communities respond? Because to your point, if funding is slashed, of course, DEI is rolled back, communities won't have the supports they traditionally have had. So how do they respond in this moment? Because they won't be able to look to the federal government for assistance. Some of them may not be able to look to the state government for assistance. How do folks respond in their communities who will be impacted the most by this?
Yeah, I would say we respond how we always have, and I would say with mutual aid. I would say with supporting our organizations in the community. I think we've seen with cases in Florida where they have been, creating schools on Saturday to teach our kids Black history. I, in fact, have an online class where I'm teaching kids nearly every Monday Black history. I think we have to realize too with Title I funding, although it did help us out a lot, overall, it's a smaller percentage of what we got from state property taxes. So hopefully this is a call for us to go back to understanding the roles that local government plays in our everyday life. It will be a struggle, but I think that if we think historically as an entirety of this situation, we can respond by building community with folks who are already on the ground doing this work.
And Linda, one of the ways that folks are seemingly responding to DEI rollbacks are boycotts. So Until Freedom, Strike for All, and a number of organizations are calling for and participating in mass boycotts of Target. How effective do you think that will be in this moment? And do you see boycotts as an effective tool in responding to DEI?
Sure. I think boycotts are an effective tool across all social justice issues. And one of the, I would say, some of the greatest benefits of that isn't necessarily boycotting a product or shifting your money, but rather raising the consciousness of the buyer so that they understand where their money is going and really beginning to question the power of money and the power of capitalism. And that I first just want to pay a lot of respect for people who got up and said, DEI is important to me, and that's why I'm going to participate, whether in a boycott or a buy-in, and that some of our traditional African-American civil rights organizations that has been leading this work for decades have done. That being said, it is important to note that in the history of Black liberation, we have actually geared towards cooperatives, towards collectives, towards mutual aid, to say that we should be not just questioning where our money is going, but the power of the money and the system, and whether or not we, in this moment, where DEI is being used against communities to divide communities, but also DEI is about looking at the curriculum that people are learning, the authors that are coming into the room. And when you take Angela Davis out of the classroom, when you take Bell Hooks out of the classroom, when you take Malcolm X out of the classroom, the consciousness raising that comes from the fight on a local level, which New York City has experienced for years, can certainly help people understand, okay, if I have to reorient my learning, I have to reorient my actions, my behaviors, and I think that that's the type of questioning in an economic system we need.
And Melissa, sometimes that's challenging for folks to do. How do you reorient my thinking, my actions, my behavior? How does local government help that to happen, particularly with respect to educational curriculums, workforce? What role does local government playing in helping folks reorient?
Well, I think it was mentioned by the guest online, and I think it's really important. I think as government, and this is something we have to demand of our leadership, is we have to really reevaluate our budgets and where is our money going. If we are going to see a disinvestment in localities, and if the importance of local government is going to assume greater importance in our lives, well, how do we fill that vacuum?
And what do you say to folks who say the budget is what it is? We can't do anything about it.
We can change it. We can completely reorient it, and the times demand it. That we need to put into the priorities that are going to really substantiate what we value. And that is something we have to demand. Unfortunately, we're having a situation with our local leadership that gives me great concern. But we have the ability, to make that change at a local level. We're going to have local elections at some point here locally. We can make those changes as well, but we have to demand that we reorient our budgets to bolster what we value, and we can define what we value, like the conversations that we're having right now.
Certainly. Ernest, I'm going to turn to you. What is DEI? We're talking a little bit about what DEI means for Black folks, brown folks, folks who will be impacted by the rollback because we know it's important. What does DEI mean for white supremacists, though, historically? When you roll back DEI, when you appear to give a leaning towards white nationalism. What does this mean for white supremacists in America in this moment?
Yeah, for white supremacists, and I think just in this moment, we're seeing the reclamation of unapologetic white supremacy. To those who subscribe to that notion, it feels as though they're being erased, but we don't even take into account the ways in which they benefited from diversity, equity, inclusion. In fact, organizations that operate from that framework are often more profitable. You know, there are numerous studies that talk about how America is losing out on trillions of dollars by not solving this issue of systemic racism, in fact. So they don't, for those who subscribe to this, especially those who are poor economically, they don't understand how they're actually hurting themselves. It's not just a black thing. We're talking about diversity of all different things, not just racially. And America hasn't even really moved towards the equity portion of this, right? Or even the full inclusion. But what we've seen in an educational setting is this implementation of this American education that's pro-imperialism, pro-colonialism.
And Ernest, to your point, oftentimes when folks think about DEI, there's a lot of folks who are saying DEI didn't do what it was supposed to. It didn't benefit communities of colors in the way that it should have. And you see that oftentimes Brown versus the Board of Education and schools now being more segregated than they were before. How do we respond to that in this moment? Does DEI really provide the solution communities need? Or should we be pivoting away from DEI in this moment as well?
You know, when you are assembling something, you can't stop halfway and say it's not working right if you haven't finished assembling it, you know? And that's kind of how I look at it right now. We are a work in progress as people. We have so many imperfect structures. We can put forward something that we say is an ideal and then be honest with ourselves and say, we're not there yet, but it's a step in the right direction. That's the thing right there. I think that we keep missing. We discount the fact that we have a lot of black folks who work in contracting situations where they need that look. They are just as qualified, if not more qualified, but they don't get that look in my state of Illinois without having certain mechanisms in place. So this can impact everybody. It's not just about the corporate job. It's about the look, the contracting, the construction, the cleaning services, and so on and so forth.
Right. Now, DEI, to many, may not see the ways in which it impacts so many pieces. Prior to the Trump administration doing all the things that it's doing, there were robust conversations around the country around reparations. And it appears that many of those conversations have ended. How important is a conversation around reparations in this moment? Is there room to pivot to have that dialogue? And how helpful can it be into communities during a Trump administration?
So reparations is an extremely important conversation. And to my fellow panelists, we have over 450 years of white supremacist violence in multiple ways. Reparations is a long overdue promise that we must fulfill. There is no negotiable on that. So with respect to this existing moment, New York City has legislation that was sponsored and led by courageous council members, Councilmember Lewis, Williams, and Hudson, that created companion bills for both a New York City study on reparations that specifically focuses on the role of government in perpetuating and perpetrating slavery, Jim Crow, and the legacy of slavery, and a companion bill for truth, healing, and reconciliation. The racial healing component of this work is essential to building the networks for mutual aid, for cooperative economics, for the protection of one another. And the study on reparations for New York City is essential to be able to excavate how did our Department of Small Business Services or our finance team, well, not just respond, but how did they build up white supremacy and create the foundation of that in local government? It is still here, and the conversation is still alive, and we have New Yorkers.
And it's still being used.
Yes.
Great conversation, but we'll have to end it there. I would like to thank our guest, former Speaker of the New York City Council, Melissa Mark-Viverito, the Executive Director of New York City's Commission on Racial Equity, Linda Tijani, and anti-racism historian Ernest Krim. When I come back, we'll have some final thoughts. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip. For some final thoughts, many of Trump's actions are not new. We have seen previous presidents roll back progress and push agendas targeted at specific communities, from commutations to agendas to make America great again. We have seen and our people have experienced much of this before. Many can argue our responses are also similar. It is imperative to know our history to understand where our responses have fallen short or could be truly transformed. The history of boycotts are ripe with examples of where we have transformed the social experience of our people, but they are also full of examples of where we have failed to build and control more power than we could have. Not to mention numerous missed opportunities in our history. As we push for change, we must be clear that we need something different and that we must build something different. Let this moment be a moment where we know our history so that it doesn't repeat itself, and where we innovate our approaches to truly build a new and better reality and way forward. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip.